Hello everybody and welcome. I'm Nancy Clark. I'm a member of the committees of both of the organisations involved with this evening, so the Friends of the National Library and also of the Australian Garden History Society. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Some of you are joining us from other places online, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the places you are today. This evening we're continuing what's become a tradition for the Friends of the National Library and the Australian Garden History Society, our joint annual lecture. Back in 2010, we presented our first joint event. Tricia Dixon, who has close links with both bodies, gave a talk on literary landscapes. Since then, this has happened every year except for the bad year of 2020 when practically nothing happened. And our topics have been very diverse: landscaping around Lake Burley-Griffin, botanical paintings of Ferdinand Bauer, Chinese gardens, Australian war graves, on and on. Very, very diverse. And before we start, I'd just like to say, I suppose, from the insider's perspective of belonging to both organisations, how very valuable it is to share lectures, events with other organisations. It's a real pleasure. So now to our speaker. Dr. Julian Raxworthy, who's lurking over there, is now a Canberra local, but his education and career have taken him to many places. He has the distinction, a really valuable one I think, of being both a practical gardener and horticulturalist and a landscape architect. And he has academic qualifications from Sydney, Melbourne and Queensland. That's diverse. Currently, he is Associate Professor and Discipline Lead at the University of Canberra. He's taught all over Australia, basically, and also at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, at the University of Virginia in the US, and at the National School of Landscape Architecture in Versailles. And he's also presented scholarly lectures in various parts of the world. His book, Overgrown, front cover, Overgrown Practices Between Landscape Architecture and Gardening, is the basis of his talk this evening. Originally published in 2018, it's been quite literally just now, been reissued in paperback, which is a fine tribute to the ongoing value of his argument. And I will now hand over to Julian, who's going to speak to us for about 40 minutes. After that, there will be an opportunity for questions. And please, please turn off your phones. Thanks, Julian.
So thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today. You guys do real history. I'm nominally a theorist who draws upon history when it suits me. And so this lecture, partly because of the brief that was rigorously put to me, was to contextualise it locally. So there is a modicum of local contextuality and then the rest of the lecture. And so over the lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm really going to try to find points to bring home these ideas to a Canberra context, and I think it's too early for me to say that I'm a local, but I really love the city. And my stepfather used to, in the 70s, I used to come here, and I remember you know, the bus stops, and I remember the bike paths and going, this is like a futuristic wonderland. So I've got a deep affinity, and my wife and I really love living here. So what I'm going to do is, you know, I'm going to start with Canberra for a moment. And I'm sure I've been told that people who are authors of this may or may not be in the audience. And so obviously we know that hedges are not just hedges in Canberra. And in the fine study by Bernadette Hinson, I wonder if she's here, you know, she talks about how in the 1920s the hedge was a really fundamental tool in the kind of language of Canberra, and how it came in and its relationship to the garden city. And she also says something which I think is really lovely in here, which is that she says that when she's talking about the history of hedges, where there's a nice whole chapter, chapter 12, on hedges in Canberra, it says, however, hedging also means avoiding decisive action, and the history of planning policy and its administration in relationship to the meeting place of public and private lands exhibits considerable ambivalence. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. And of course we note that, you know, Lindsay Pryor was a big fan of those hedges. And, you know, he talks about, you know, how the use of hedges in Canberra has been highly successful and has led to much satisfactory street design. Its success depends on uniform maintenance. And we'll talk about this idea of whether uniform maintenance is something we want or don't want in a moment. As a method of treatment, however, it has become out of step, particularly on economic grounds, because cutting has not been mechanised. And of course, we now see the terrible things that mechanisation has done to the public landscape, as everything just turns into balls, and if it doesn't turn into a ball, it just disappears. And so, you know, that fascination with mechanisation we see all over Canberra, whether it's, you know, mechanistic thinking producing, you know, concrete swales, etc. So it's an interesting monument to history. So in a way, this idea of preserving a landscape is a really interesting idea to me, and it's the heritage types like get really into this, and I'm not one of them, so I'm not going to pretend to be. But what's really interesting to me, I mean, I did sort of, in preparation for this lecture, you know, my wife and I kind of ran around very quickly around Ainslie, and we did a hedge inspection. And, you know, we were saying, you know, it's part policy compliance and part site inventory, and that's on the kind of the sort of empirical top right. But in the actual fact, it's like a picturesque journey, or it's a holiday in the everyday. And so I think, you know, we're all fans of landscape here. We're all here because we love gardens, we love plants, we love that. And so it's fascinating when you think, you know, good hedge, bad hedge, you know, that is there. And I'll show you examples of both of those in this lecture. But let's talk about my book for a moment. And so I'm going to give you an extremely fast version of this, because this lecture can go for an hour and a half, but it's actually going to go for 36 more minutes. And so the book is in two parts. One part is called Figuring Growth, and the other part is called Gardening Design. It's a piece of case study research, utilises a methodology that's called sort of theory building, where each chapter builds and inserts, sort of builds a theory across the book. And overall, it makes an argument towards something that I call, and I like creating terms, who doesn't, called the veridic. And in a way, the architects have this term called the tectonic, which is about how things are built. And I've always said, you know, from a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Meyer at the University of Virginia, said, you know, landscape needs some way of thinking about itself that's different to architecture. And she said, what's the medium specificity of landscape? And it's about plants, obviously. But what's that mean? And so the whole of this book is really about that question and about a kind of collaboration that we have with plants. So the first part, Figuring Growth, is about the idea that, in a way, in a design sense, we utilise plants to structure design, where the act of structuring is what I'm calling figuring. This is theory. And so then the bottom part, Gardening Design, is going the opposite, where design emerges from the act of gardening, not where it's imposed. So this sort of plays with both of those directions. And a kind of few basic assumptions underlie the project, and I'll talk to them quickly. And so they're kind of approaches. And so I use this idea of as like a rhetorical device. I use the idea of the avenue. And so I talk about the idea that when someone lays out an avenue, the avenue is sort of, there's a drawing inherently, it's like a parametric drawing where there's a series of dots, they're equidistantly placed, they're set up around their spacing with ideas about the projection of the future, that the plants will grow and they'll grow into each other, and that somehow the plants are uniform. And in a way, we're building a graphic. That's a graphic idea. I love an avenue, by the way. But it is actually, in a way, the idea of it is an idea about consistency. But of course, what we know about nice avenues is that they've got this kind of waviness to them. There's actually some sense where the trees move a little bit. And so in the first instance, one of the languages of the book is about design and design language. And I'm very much, I'm interested in form. I'm interested in design as an act, as the creation of space. And for a long time, you may not know this, but in landscape architecture for the last 20 years, form has been really a no-no sort of thing to talk about because the language has been around process. And so this arose out of my PhD where I said, whenever we talk about form, we're actually talking about process, because with plants, any form you've got is the result of the plant growing. So you can't really separate those ideas. So one idea, one basic theoretical thing is it's about form, it's about space, it's about design. The other thing is that it's about biology. And now that seems obvious to say, but a lot of the time if we think about botany, and this is why probably, Lindsay Pry is so interesting and is in a way that thing where biology is the only way that the plants grow to achieve their formal effects. You can love planting something in a nice geometry, but if the plant can't grow because of a biological reason, fail. And so in a way, there's been this sort of separation where the plant people are doing the plant thing, the design people are doing the design thing, both of them are criticising each other, but without one or the other, in a way, they can't really operate. And so in a way, the project was also about bringing them together. And so what I talk about here in this example is, because I spent a long time in Brisbane, was to say, that the Ficus religiosa, which is an amazing fig tree, and it's the fig tree under which Buddha is said to have, gained enlightenment, you could plant those on any centre you want, but they're going to try to take over the world. And they're going to drop their aerial roots down, and they're going to get and vary to the local circumstances. And in a way, they're going to become a highly diverse organism. So what happens to those series of dots? They start as dots, they start as a graphic figure, and suddenly the movement of the plants change that, make it something different. That's so special. Like, bricks don't do that. Like, what materials do we use in design that change over time? Do we have a language to talk in design about change over time? And so the final one is to sort of say that, I started, as Nancy alluded to, I never finished high school, and I did an apprenticeship at Ryde College with Woollahra Council in Sydney. Lots of great figs, lots of great trees in Woollahra. And, this is where I saw this. There's a certain point where the tree starts to grow. Power line. And so, in a way, there's another point here where the gardener has to intervene in the relationship and life cycle of the plant. The designer's well off the picture. The person who drew the two dots, they're well gone. So there's another person who's got a shaping formal role there, which is the gardener as a figure. We don't really hear, obviously you, all garden historians, people interested in garden history, are gardeners, professionals. Do we listen to the stories of gardeners? They might be rough, they might be working professionally in certain sorts of ways, covered in tattoos and listening to metal, service people. What's their story? How do we take a labour story in that sort of picture? So those are the three areas: design, biology and labour are the three bases of the book, to try and understand those stories. And we better get going. Okay, so first section. Now each of the sections starts with a graphic. And in a way, this is like a way of trying to describe the story of the chapter in a way that you can understand it. And so when I wrote the book and we put it together, I was lucky to work with an amazing graphic designer, Molly Siemens, at MIT Press. And we decided that the book was going to tell its story for lazy people via photos and captions, so that you could read the whole book without actually reading the whole book. And so, in a way, this diagram describes a really basic thing, and it starts from a contention that a landscape architect, a really fine landscape architect from the US called Fletcher Steele made, which was to sort of talk about the French in terms of them punishing plants. Now, I'm a real fan of French landscape. I'm a massive, massive fan of French landscape. Because I think, in actual fact, plants, when they respond to actions, that's a response. So if you were pruning a plant, and I'll show you some plants that have been killed dead with pruning in a moment, but in a way, that's a reaction. You prune something, it responds. It's called traumatic reiteration. So we can't really say that it's an a kind of an anti-plant move, it's actually catalysing plant systems. In their DNA, it's ready to go. That's there. And we know there's a term that's called hormesis. Nicholas Nassim Taleb, in his book called Anti-Fragility, talked about how the idea that you push organisms and they respond stronger and harder than they were originally. And we know that pushing is really important. That's why we know that you need to, as you get older, you need to lift weights, you need to do these things, because in actual fact, that process actually allows you to develop strength. And so this first chapter talks about how the shape of the French garden is not actually a shape of design, it's a shape made by maintenance. And so here we're sort of showing how the geometry of a French garden results from a series of different tools that create the form of the landscape. And so in a way, rather than just saying, oh, we look at these amazing axes and these goosefoot intersections, let's actually talk about acts of agriculture that made formal gardens. It's weird to think about the French garden as being an agricultural space, but it is. So this garden is one of my favourite gardens, and it really arose from I discovered it because, all of you will know Penelope Hobhouse. And so Penelope Hobhouse wrote a book called Gardens of Europe. And so with Patrick, I can't remember his name. Anyway, before the internet, I was a smoker in a Renault Clio driving between Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte. And I had the book open next to me, bad, and I saw a sign that said, Chateau and Garden of Courance. And so I pulled over, luckily to the right side, to the correct side of the road, and I looked at it and it said that, Hobhouse said, it said that Le Notre designed this garden, but if he did, he was in an unusually romantic frame of mind at the time. And so I thought that's worthy of a diversion. So as I did often, I talked my way into that garden because it was closed, and I met the owners, and I worked on documenting this garden over many years. Now, Vincent Scully talked about it as a symphony of grass, water and trees. But what I really discovered is that it was actually, and that's what this alludes to, it was a place that had hundreds of gardens at one stage, and by the time it is now, it's basically got one person on a tractor who maintains it. And so the symphony arises through a stripping back and a stripping back and a stripping back process that's actually about technology. And so what I tried to show in this is to talk about how, in actual fact, that landscape and its spatiality, these are all of a range of documented vegetal treatments that central Allée d'Honneur had at that time. And so, in a way, I'm trying to say that the vegetation, and the case I was trying to make in this chapter is, vegetation changes space. It's not just that landscape receives plants, it's that landscape changes how we understand space in places. And when we do that, what we understand is also some quite different things. And so I alluded to this idea that I crawl through hedges. I do crawl through hedges. And so in actual fact, here's two hedges. The first one is this one here, and this is when I first came up with this idea. And this is at Vaux-le-Vicomte. And it was visiting Vaux-le-Vicomte that I really just sort of came up with my thesis, which is to say, that in there is a regenerating forest. So that's actually a forest where no one's really getting in there after a certain point. And on this side, we've got a highly manicured landscape, which is how we think of the French landscape. But in actual fact, this edge, this transition between mowing and grass, topping of gravel, pruning of trees, cutting of hedge, in a way what I call is like a timed hedge. All of those actions occur at different points of time. On one side of it, we have natural regeneration. On the other side of it, we have highly manicured processes. So in a way, what you're thinking about is the idea that the edge is a space of transition between processes, between ecologies over time, and that people intervene in that process. And you see that in all of the French landscapes, because in actual fact, they are hunting grounds or they are forestry or whatever. So at Courance, what we're seeing here is, there's a classic moment where I sort of love these moments where we see that process. And because I was doing bush regeneration in Sydney for about 5 years, I kind of very tuned towards when a system is actually doing its own thing. And so I'm really fascinated by the idea that there's a mediation moment in planting between those two states. And of course, what you also see in this landscape is there's a term called prochronism, which is how a shell, when you see a shell and the shape of the shell has all those curls on it, that's a record of change. And so Proquinism, in a way, when we look at this, when Hobhouse is talking about these trees, and Pascal, the fantastic French landscape architect, Pascal Cribière, also talked about those and the sort of waviness of it. That's a record of the French Revolution. That's a record of 150, like 100 odd years of no one pruning a tree and coming back after the original planting and going, I kind of think I like that. But it wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the fact that there was a pause, an interruption in that garden's life. Similarly, the Germans occupied it in a period. Then the Americans occupied it in a period. When the family got back, the guy who came back to that site had to say, I've got to do this with a tractor now. But when the family left that property, they had X many gardeners, they had all of that sort of thing. That was the change. So in a way, this is where, I'm totally going to improvise around this relationship here, but, this is where, we see those sort of resonances, when we look at the sort of the garden city or the city beautiful. Obviously, we have to recognise that the history of the avenue is broader than just France, and that the history of the hedge is actually kind of potentially Danish. Hey, so in actual fact, this sort of geometry that we're seeing, and what is really fascinating about Canberra is those things we might call them the dim resonances of other systems that come into play in the Australian landscape. And, I think that what I love about that period of planting that you see in Canberra, particularly in some of those parks where you'll see the European plants and the native trees put in the same space, where there's none of this dogmatism that we see now about it, where there's actually an understanding of qualities of vegetation rather than just ideologies of vegetation. So the next chapter in this section is called Architecture with Plants. And so I'll just zoom in on this image because it tells the story. So one of the most famous landscape architectural gardens in the world is the Miller Garden. That was for a house for Miller in Indiana, who was a earth-moving machinery producer. And Eero Saarinen designed the house, and of course, Saarinen, they have a relationship to Canberra, as we know, because they were in the competition and judging. I looked at their entry, I can't remember whether it was father or son's entry, but yeah. So they have a relationship. And what's interesting is for landscape architects, when they talk about this garden, when they started to talk about it more, and that's this is the honey locust LA, basically. Again, if we think about honey locusts, if they're not on the invasive species list in Canberra, they probably should be, but they probably are actually. And so, this was at the time of early CAD here, was like how they were describing the planting there. And the argument that Greg Bleem made in Mark Tribe's book was, this here is a kind of architectural way of using plants. And so here is the internal layout of the building, and Kylie talked about the pinwheel and how that geometry moved outwards. And so in a way, the idea that the landscape is structured in this way that that the trees are operating as architectural objects. And I had one of my students say to me at the University of Cape Town when we did a tutorial, and I was talking to them about the idea of how fundamental the idea of growth is to the garden. And he said, according to that argument, Rangi would not be a garden, right? Because growth is fundamental to the garden, it's a rock garden. And it was like, yeah, okay, it was a good call. And what was interesting about that, though, was the highlighting of the role of growth. And so what I found interesting was that all of the discussions about this garden were always talking about the plants like they were architecture. And that's because the form language of design coming through modernism, this is the work of a guy called James Rose, who was looking at plant typologies, trying to actually find ways to fit them in within a Bauhaus language. It was amazing stuff. I'm a real fan of it. But, in a way, it was sort of like, what is the plantness of this? Where is the plant here? And so this is where the term analogue, it's a weird way to know it, but the term analogue is used to describe something that resembles something else in policy. So, for instance, one pharmaceutical that's similar to another pharmaceutical is called an analogue of that pharmaceutical. So I argue in this chapter that, in actual fact, plants, this project actually, as much as it's amazing formally, it's actually treating plants like they're an analogue for architecture. And is that an approach that celebrates plants? Because if plants are about growth, how does design utilise growth? If it's not utilising growth, are we just doing architecture with plants? And that's the argument I make here. And it's held up also because of the fact that when you start to examine the photos, and luckily the Indianapolis Museum of Art put all of the archive of the Miller Garden on there when they acquired the property through a bequest. When you look at them, I started to look at the images of trees going, there's a whole lot of younger specimens amongst this. So when you dig into the correspondence, what you discover is that the way that the garden and terraces were created, and this is all fill on this site, meant that the plants, the trees, constantly got infected by various pests and diseases because of the growing conditions. And so as one tree got taken out, suddenly the owner would say, I better find another big one that looks exactly the same as that one so my effect can do this. And so over time it meant that it's like the ship of Theseus, where every one gets taken out. Is it the same avenue once every single tree is gone? And you know, when I talked to and this is a story I discovered because I talked to the gardeners, and they said, yeah, we've actually not been able to get that to grow. It's been replanted 3 times. Every single one of them has been replaced 5 times. Each time we're trying to get a bigger one. So in a way, this icon of planting design was a really failed planting. And that's an example to me, you know, this is when I visited it, you know, this is what it looked like. This is its replanting in the 90s. They pulled it out twice since then, right? It should be still the same plants. It was only built in the 1950s. And so it's just that thing where suddenly the story, when you hear the story of the gardener, the whole thing changes. And so, you know, what I find fascinating, you know, in my little Ainsley survey, you know, was that, you know, probably the one that is the most interesting to me is this one. You know, if we look at, you know, if we think about the sort of precept of this, which is about sight. So in a way, we think about the good hedge versus the bad hedge. It was always about what the height is in relationship to the eye. And so in a way, it's always treating that landscape as a formal proposition, which I'm completely fine about. That's an interesting thing to me. And so, you know, once we accept that the person who did that hedge, that's actually a photo of them right there. That's a photo of how they are as a person, which is great. I'm happy for them. And, you know, this is a photo of somebody else. And what's nice about this is the way that there's different layers here. And so on the one hand, is it a compliant hedge? Yes. But is it actually also breaking the view? It's got a very subtle manipulation. And for me, this thing about how the fruit trees, or well, I don't know if they're fruit trees, but they're probably something in rosaceae behind there. So, you know, the way that they're a subject of pruning that allows them to operate in a certain way as a response to the organism, and the lower one is also in response to the organism. Suddenly I'm going, there's every chance that some of you who actually live here, in which case I love this one, I love the other one too. You know, this is also that thing. And I love the way that someone's going, yeah, we're going to work with this, but we're doing a little thing to reveal and deal with our own privacy, and the fact that, you know, this ambivalence, what she call it, you know, this ambivalence, the hedging of bets between the public and the private, which actually relates to my next body of research, which is about land tenure. And so this case study is another one that's really interesting to me. And, wow, okay. That sounds like the library's about to close type of announcement moment. But yeah, I'm going to kind of speed through a bit further because I have an idea about time. But this is a guy called Sven Ingvar Andersen. Sven Ingvar Andersen is one of the great Danish landscape architects, and he has a garden called Marnas. And when I visited this garden, when I discovered it, this woman called Anne Whiston Spurn, who's a really fantastic landscape theorist, you know, wrote one of the pioneering books on landscape ecology in the 1980s, The Granite Garden. She wrote a book called The Language of Landscape. And so this garden is because Andersen is halfway between being a modernist and halfway between being postmodern, you know, these are hens. So this is the Henyard. And so he wrote a little series of thought pieces where he said, these are hawthorns, and the hawthorns they're hens for as long as I can get up a ladder to prune them. So what's interesting about them is they're always either and both a hawthorn and a hen at any moment at the same time. And so that's a propensity, a material propensity tied to people. And I find that really fascinating. And I mean and so when I arrived there, and he said, one day I'm too old, the hens will turn into a hawthorn grove. And I did meet him, but I never got to his garden with him. And when I went there thinking, okay, we're going to have a hawthorn grove now, what I discovered is the hens are still there. And that's because for his kids, the hens were him cutting the hedges and him making the hens. That's what Dad did. And Dad's died, and so we've got to keep it the way Dad did. And I'm like, have you read his paper? The monument to him would be to let it become a hawthorn grove. That would actually be the monument to him. And so what I discovered, of course, because I crawl through hedges, is that in actual fact, when it was planted, what's fascinating is, when it was planted and set up, there was a sort of a layout of rooms in this landscape. And that's the kind of layout of the rooms there. And so what I did with limited time and coming through the back end of the garden rather than the front end of the garden, which is always instructive, is that I went through because I'd seen these photos here about the plantings, and here, those are the only photos I'd seen of the rooms. But what I discovered was that the landscape had spaces like this, and it had extraordinary rooms where in actual fact those same hedges had become these amazing transparent things. And what I measured is I measured them and discovered that each one of those was still on the same spacing, was still a hawthorn. And so something happened in his life where probably one started to get away. He got a bit famous, probably didn't cut his hedges for a while. One started to get away, probably developed his theory post-rationalisation to describe the escaping hedges. But he actually made an amazing room of transparency. And the argument I was trying to make in this chapter was to say, if we think that the planting plan is going to do everything, it can't create those sort of effects because that planting spacing is completely consistent. And so what's the difference between the fact that it stays like that or the fact that it becomes like that or the fact that it becomes that? It's that on top of the spacing, somebody intervened in time. And so the gardener opens spatial opportunities that we wouldn't have just through designing with planting. Now that's not something which, for the landscape architects will understand what I'm talking about, but in a way we specify and we let go. At the end of the defects period or the consolidation period, I think of what they're calling it in Canberra, right? Then after that it's like, see ya, and then the guy with the headphones and the device gets in there and then it's on. So when we project into the future, how do we know what happens? Because we just let it go, right? We just let it go. And Neil Hobbs is doing a really nice evaluation at the moment, we talked about today, of the light rail plantings, and I'm doing more of those kind of evaluations with my students. So what I sort of say in this chapter from him is to say, that's all one plant. One of it's a hedge, one of it's actually one of it's a shrub, and then another one's a tree, and it's all on the same plant. That's one plant. So what an amazing material propensity. How can we work with it? Not just by specifying it on a planting plan. You have to work with it in a maintenance way. Maintenance has to be a creative force. Do we do that at the moment? Not really. Did they do it in this time of prior? They did, and they had to go, we can't afford this anymore, And so it's an interesting thing. Can we really work with plants in the public landscape until we start to take maintenance on board? So, here are these kind of moments where I saw that, where that's a record of one hedge where it's been pruned at a certain point, that's the dominant line, then no one pruned it and it went off, and it's like probably the owner's going, what to do with it now, And so in a way, that's the story. There's a story of maintenance in each of those finishes. So as we move into the second part, which I will move through relatively quickly, the second part's probably talking more about gardening in the way we might understand it. And so here we are talking about the work of Roberto Bell Marx. And of course, Roberto Bell Marx is the premier planting designer, amazing guy, a really incredible landscape architect and businessman. And so, when you go to the CTO Bell Marx, which is his own garden, you realise that he was in a business of collecting plants, growing plants, specifying plants, selling plants to clients, selling maintenance back to them. What a business. And so I came across a piece of writing. And so it's got, as a landscape, it's got the kind of classic Bell Marx moments in it. It's got the sort of Bell Marx plantings that you see, where you do what he called correlation of texture, where we've all got the same leaf shape, but then we utilise a different colour or a different materiality around it. That's what he called correlation of texture. And so, you know, what's interesting is that that place, his garden, became something for the heritage, the patrimony. And the director got sacked. And so I found a post he did where he described how Bell Marx used that landscape as a place to test. And what was happening now is that as a landscape architect running him, they wanted him to just make Bell Marx-esque like landscapes. And he said, you're missing the point. It's a laboratory. It's a place of testing. That's what it's about. So you hear the same story of the people who've got the hens, right? The idea to try to make static something that's dynamic. And so what was really interesting is I kind of had, the language he talked about it was quite very scientific. And I sort of thought, well, you don't need to make that sort of thing, because in a way, in the landscape, because plant biology is your tool, it's always a science experiment. But as a gardener knows, you'll never use a plant that doesn't work for you in terms of some aesthetic sense. So biology and plant selection are always tied together. You can't separate those things. And so to call it a laboratory and use science language is to mistake the fact that the art of planting is always technical, even when it's actually aesthetic. And, you know, that's always the amazing thing about people like Pete Udolph. And so, you know, he was the biggest collector and he's still got the biggest collections of families in the Araceae family. And so, you know, which is the philodendron family, and the arum family, and I know that we're not allowed to plant arums, and I'm very disappointed by that because, you know, we've spent a lot of time in South Africa, and arum's a beautiful plant. So what was really fascinating was that, you know, he actually, he had this thing where he would go with often architecture students, go out to the bush to collect plants, and they'd go into the rainforest and, you know, they'd binoculars up there on the back of the truck. You know, I think I see a bromeliad, go and, you know, climb trees, you know, intersect with spiders and snakes and pull back the plant. And so what he would then do is he would acclimate it, and then he would do this thing called it to get and to use. And he would then grow the plant enough to acclimate it over a few generations, and then he would put it in multiple situations. Full sun, partial sun, no water, and he would just observe what it was doing. And that's something that Henk Gerritsen, who's a fantastic Dutch wave theorist, wrote books with Pete Udolph, would call ecological amplitude, the range of things you can do with it. And so, you know, that's where what's fascinating to me is that, say we look at a characteristic Bell Marx planting like that. You know, this is basically two species of probably buffalo grass here that are, maybe it's kikuyu, I don't know. But, you know, woven into that space. Now, obviously, the first thing they're going to do is they're organisms and they're going to try to do this, right? The more aggressive one is going to colonise the space of the less aggressive one. And so when you see that landscape now, can I see a ghost in there? Is there a ghost in there? I think there is a ghost in there. What's the difference between somebody in that one, even though that looks actually like fresh turf in the middle of that one, but someone in there is probably with a pair of scissors like out there cutting it, right? Why shouldn't they, you know? Why shouldn't they? What's this idea we have that maintenance is bad? Maybe maintenance is good. Maybe that gradient that we have around how much we do or how much we don't do is a portrait of ourselves, you know? And maybe that's fine. And so, you know, that idea of the laboratory, you know, these things, do they work? You know, they're everywhere. So, you know, the nature strip in Canberra is a place of laboratory. It's a place of testing. You know, it's, you know, there was Diogenes, you know, famous, you know, crazy Greek. He had this thing where he was really resistant to the fact that the public space was used for private purposes. And that's why he didn't like, for instance, business to be in the public space, you know. That's why he did crazy, unpleasant things, was to try to, as a protest, to demonstrate, hey, this is a place of discourse and whatever else, of course, of slaves and whatever else. But, you know, and so like moments like this, you know, I love those moments because that landscape is in a total, like there's something going on there, right? And it's that thing where if you look in these things, they say it's great because people's front yards will contribute to the street because of the fact that the hedge is low. Oh yeah, they will. They will contribute to the street. You know, recognising that I have 5 minutes left, I'll just quickly talk about the last two case studies. So, you know, a lot comes from procrastination. It's one of my particular talents and curses. And when I was working on my PhD, my wife's chuckling there, she knows exactly what I'm talking about. When I was working on my PhD, I was in Fremantle for a year. I was with Richard Weller, I was a research fellow there for a year. And I was staying in Fremantle, which is like one of the most wonderful places in the country. And I was in Mary Martin's bookstore, because I love books, and even though I'm coming to terms with my addiction. And I saw this book, Some Branch Against the Sky, The Practice of Marginal Gardening. And as soon as I saw it, because I always, at a certain point when I realised doing bush regeneration, it's gardening. Bush regeneration is gardening. I realised we're just gardening here, and if I stop weeding, this is over. So let's not pretend that this is a restoration project. Let's just accept that what I'm doing in Rich People's Gardens in Wallara and what I'm doing in the Crown of Newport Reserve is actually exactly the same thing for different purposes. And I recognise that, in a way, process plays out in many places. And Geoffrey Dutton, who wrote it, is a really extraordinary guy when I dug into it. You know, he was a chemist who was really working on what he called enzyme ecology, how the body operated as a, I'm going to be 5 minutes late. 5 minutes okay? 5 minutes is good, okay. Yeah, okay. So he was really fascinating because, you know, what would you call him? Not polyglot, what's the term? The polymath, right? Or, Renaissance man or whatever. And so on the one hand, he was a chemist. On the other hand, at the birth of the environmental movement, he was recognising that there was an ecology of enzymes in the body. You know, he was also a poet, and he wrote a whole lot of poetry, which I'll talk about. He was also a mountaineer, and he was what he called a wild swimmer, which is that he actually would swim in lochs, and he would take photos of underwater vegetation like it was an above-ground landscape. So he was an amazing guy. And so we talked about this idea of marginal gardening, and I think this is a really nice idea, which is he called marginal gardening the kind of gardening where, it's marginal in a whole range of ways. It's marginal because of the fact that it's on the border of cultivation. So he's in Scotland, he's right up at the level where the alpine is kicking in. So he's just on that, he's on the margin of cultivatability. He's also, his property is on the margin between where the topography changes between agriculture or environmental devastation of the beautiful, Scotland on either side. And so he's in the margin, the fold of that landscape. But, most importantly is that he's also saying he's got a marginal amount of time. So what that means is he's just marginally differentiating the garden from the environment. And so what's fascinating when you see it is, this is what it used to look like at that period. Stefan Buczaki, who people might recognise his books, fantastic books about ecology from the 80s and gardening, talked about how I discovered it when I followed up on it. I had that book, I hadn't read it. But, what's interesting is, he's introducing plants in that landscape, but other than that, the landscape is actually just an existing landscape being pruned. And so it was really fascinating to and his criteria was, you kind of do a double take, but you don't know for sure whether it's been planted or how it's operating. Admittedly, that looks like a border, we can see that. But nonetheless, that idea is really fascinating. And so, of course, when I visited it with his kids, this is where, for them, the job is keep the path open like Dad used to keep it open. Again, the story is a process story being treated like an artefact. And he had, and you understand why, the classic was going through that landscape. I don't know if people know this plant here. Yeah, but what's classic is at that time I was under treatment for eczema, and the guy who was taking me through that landscape is a doctor, he's the son. And I pushed against that plant, and he said, well, that's actually that's a treatment, that plant, but in actual fact, the dosage you've probably taken from that isn't actually going to make that a bit of a problem. So I'll keep an eye on you for the rest of the day because that's going to trigger your eczema in such a bad way. So, what was amazing, he dealt with that landscape as a kind of series of routes where he would walk that route, and then he kind of, in these little hutches here, he would actually keep fertiliser, books, tools. So when it was raining or snowing, he would just secret himself like a hobbit back into one of those, and then I've still got my idea on the time, it's all right. So he would secret himself, and then he would pop out. And so, what I loved about him, is this is his sort of poetry, It's only the simple sunlight on a fence post out of snow, and I come to set it upright at the cost of a single blow. Then I leave them to the sunlight, one straight post, trodden snow. And what I loved about it, and something he talked about, was around this idea that there is a kind of thermodynamic relationship in the landscape. You do something, expend energy, you release an energy in the system, it leaves a physical artefact, even however temporary. And that idea, I decided, is a really fundamental idea to this idea of the veridic. So the final case study I'm going to talk about, yeah, that was just me. Like, I love these moments. You know, I love moments where you see people who are utilising weed species in a way where you go, or weed/non, you know, like, I love those moments where someone's recognised an aesthetic quality out of plants that will do it themselves, and they're like, yeah, I can let that go because there's some qualities in there, the hellebores or whatever. I'm like, yeah, I can go with that. So the final case study is at a place called Insul Hobro. And Insul Hobro is a really amazing art landscape. And in that landscape, what I do with this project is I tell 3 stories. And so it's an amazing landscape because it's a series of these pavilions that are art galleries, little art spaces in this landscape. And when you move through that landscape into those spaces, there's actually no interpretation. You walk on a path, the path goes through the building. When you enter into the space, you know, there's no description about who the artist is, what it's about. You encounter it in your own narrative. You have to interpret it in your own way. Then you move out again into the landscape to the next space. And there's, you know, even though we accept that these are kind of, you know, they should be returned to Cambodia, there's this amazing thing, for example, when I walked into this pavilion where, of course, what you do, you walk in there and you see, oh, the heads are looking that way, I'm going to turn and look that way too, you know. And so it's a really extraordinary relationship to art in that project. And so the story, the final story, and the reason I found out about it is one of my colleagues, Lisa Dietrich in Europe, said, oh, you're interested in this idea of utilising horticulture to create landscapes, you should go there. And it's an amazing landscape. It's full of pollarded willows and amazing spaces like this one. And what I love about that's another example where you couldn't draw that necessarily because you could draw the planting plan of it, but someone's pruning that canopy up. And so you have an edge where it's defining an edge, but it's got a transparency right the way through it. And it's got a space where the edge is thickened, where you're in that space. These ones are like fantastic things where that canopy has actually been opened on the inside and you walk into that little vegetated room and you have lunch in there, you know. So she was like, I think you're going to like this place, and I did. And so I met this guy, Korter, and Korter this is Bernard Korter. And he was an antique dealer who'd done a PhD in nursery economics. And so he was selling Art Deco stuff to this guy, and he said, oh, you know, I love your stuff, I love the stuff you got in here. Aren't you a landscape architect? He's like, technically I'm just a nurseryman who's now gave it up to become a whatever, and said, you do my garden. And so he designed this landscape, which by his own description was basically him and a whole lot of Brazilians smoking pot for about a year and a half. And that landscape basically was one where, and this is one of my favourite moments in it, like that's what a way to create a group of willows, right? You just actually get sections of willow, you put it in the ground, you know, you create that. And so these are kind of moments, they're not designed, they're just done on site. And so he had to, the first plan that got drawn of this project was when the council said, no, this is not an art landscape, this is the Niederrhein landscape. This is the landscape of natural ecology. And he's like, it's an ex-pig farm. It's not actually a natural ecology. And so this drawing was when we found an architecture student to draw it for him so that he could submit it to council to get approved for it. So anyway, eventually the owner decided he's too arty, this guy. I want nature. He's getting too, you know, whatever. He's more interested in culture. So when he brought these in he negotiated with the council and said, yeah, you know, we actually can use these because this is a cultural landscape because people have been pollarding willows for at least 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years. So they're actually part of the natural landscape. Okay. German logic, you know, works, come on. So then he went over to Belgium to get them, and of course you can't try to bring Belgian plants into Germany, so he just had to tell them that this is firewood. They didn't have anything on them. So when he left, basically for 5 years, it grew. Pig farm, rich soil. And so this guy here, whose name is Burke Dam, who's a landscape architect, came on the project, and he said, there was nettles that were 6 foot high. The whole landscape was 6 foot high nettles. And so what he said is just all they did is mow, take away, let it grow, mow, take away. Phytoremediation, just eventually the nettles are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Obviously the problem's going to another catchment because all of that nutrient's ending up somewhere. And so eventually they reclaimed the landscape. And I said to him, he's managing it. And I said, tell me about this landscape, what is this? And so he described that process that he has he said, for me, it's all about time and labour. And so he said, my job is to get to spreadsheets, to find out when I need resources, how I need resources, and to then lend them towards the formal outcomes. And so he hated this thing of quarters because he said, this just takes me, I have to find 20 volunteers and it takes 5 days to cut that. And every year I'm like, am I going to get them, And so anyway, I said to him, how do you think about design here? And he said, I think about it as the frame and the leash, where I have a frame that the gardeners agree, the frame is rainforest. And I'm like, dude, I lived in Queensland. This is nothing, this is Germany, this is not rainforest. And he's like, no, but that fecund green atmosphere, Okay, and so once we got that, we'll let the landscape flex. And he said that's where the leash idea is. The thing goes out to the dog and you roll it back in. The dog's on a leash. How far can the landscape change? And so finally, I talked to the last guy, and his name's Klaus. And he said, the first thing he said to me is, everyone thinks that the landscape is all about this. And I'll show you this view because that's the classic view. This is the recreated Niederrhein of what Belgium and the lowlands will look like. And he said, everyone's about that. So long as I keep that view when you walk in, everyone's happy. And he said, but I'll show you what this landscape is really about. And so he took me to this place and he said, I want to take you to the disaster area. And so he said, I've got 100 trees that fell over. And so I'm never going to be able to deal with this landscape again. I'm actually, the frame, he's like, Burkhard can talk as much as he likes about the leash, but I've got 100 trees here and I'm not going to be able to keep the frame in place. And so I said to him, what's your approach to this? How are you going to deal with this? And he said to me, and I think it's not a bad place to end that particular one, he said, I'm just going to wait and see. And so, that idea that a landscape might actually develop over time, that you might optimise the tendencies that are coming through with it, is something that takes time. And so as much, designers will often say, I had a vision, and either the landscape's great because it had their initial vision, or the landscape is terrible because it wasn't there. But how did they allow and facilitate and work with the dynamism of what they've created? Sometimes that dynamism is like a failed dynamism like that. And other points it's like this. This is an example this is like a regenerating oak woodland that's happening in a nature strip in Ainslie. And I suppose it's an example of the fact that the landscape is always active and it's always doing its thing, and it's up to us to engage with it in creative ways, inspired by it, and also recognising our agency. Thanks.
Well, if anyone can think, is there anyone who has any questions? We have Ben here with a microphone. You're on.
Question, sorry.
Thanks. You touched on this, but I'd like you to expand a bit more. You talked about growth and its impact and standing back and watching. What about death? Yeah. Because one of the sources of great friction in Canberra, you will find as you do become a Canberran, is about trees that have gone beyond their life. And
we don't call it death, we call it senescence.
And it becomes it becomes a hugely problematic area, both socially and politically, in fact.
Yeah.
But life and death, I mean, one of the things that I've often tried to get through to people is that trees die, and it's a very hard concept to get across. I wondered what you'd say about death in the landscape.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm a guy, or a James Lovelock guy, and so we're actually, without death we don't have landscape. And so in actual fact, where all of the ecological cycles manifest themselves in that thermodynamic way. So we need death, right? Without death, we don't have a functioning ecological system. I'm also a lover of, I'm not an early adopter. I do like things to have, the house will get rearranged for a reason. I'll resist it, then suddenly I'll get used to it and let's keep it like this. That's the way it is. So I have a paradoxical thing about it. It's like the figs in Sydney, I think, do I want those figs to stay really big Moreton Bays along Anzac Parade? Is it a tragedy that they cut them down for the light rail? It's a tragedy because the light rail alignment is terrible and it's really not getting you as fast around because you might like to. But infrastructure rules because we need transport. So I think that in a way those questions are an interesting one. I do think climate change is going to bring them more, right? Because we can't replace the same trees always with the other ones. But I think that I'm more worried about ecological dogmatism at the expense of performance. And so, for example, I'm not a plant purist around the native question. I'm not. I think that we have a beautiful big eucalypt in our backyard that was completely dead, and did it keep me awake at night thinking about whether it would fall on the neighbour's house, and did I worry about habitat for about 10 minutes? And then after that, we took it out, right? And it's that thing where I do think we have to accept that death process is part of it. I don't think we should automatically replace what was there with what was previously there. Should we try to continue the legacy of important streetscapes? Yes, we should. I don't know if that's the question you wanted. Should we allow designers and things to change? I mean, it's only 100 years ago, right? So something like that. So it's not eternity. But yeah, it's not the right. It's like I wish I had a more ballsy answer than that. Sorry.
One more question.
I was interested in your kind of link between, I guess, politics in a quiet way and landscape and ideology. And the Scottish one particularly intrigued me, that in my experience of living in Scotland, it was such a relief to be away from England, where there wasn't hedgerows, there wasn't fineness, containment, and that I was really interested in the way you described that garden in Scotland that was so liminal between the sort of like you weren't sure if you're in nature or if you're in. I mean, but of course it was a landscape of that had been colonised over generations as well. So yeah, just that interesting nexus between politics and culture and landscape.
I mean, I can't help. I mean, I love the aesthetic qualities of that landscape, but it's a site of devastation. Like when you look at that untreed landscape that's completely covered in, I don't know, gorse or whatever it is. It's like. I have a hard moment. It's that paradox of it's so beautiful. Oh, it's such a site of ecological devastation. I mean, what people did in the UK, in the whole of that region is horrifying. We'll do it here as well, presumably. But I think that it's worth recognising that the English landscape garden had as much as you say it's about control, and it was compared to the French. The French worked out pretty quickly that Jardin Anglais was actually pretty exciting. And so I think that in actual fact, one of my case studies for my next book is about Petworth, which is a great garden, and it's, about parliamentary enclosure in gardens. Because in actual fact, that weird thing about enclosing to make space, appropriation to make space, to give the appearance of looseness and that fine line we know between the sublime, the beautiful, picturesque, and how we're playing with that. Taste as control, not too much control. Repton as poor taste, Brown as pretty poor taste, and then all the theorists out there, So I think it's I don't know if I'd agree with your characterisation of England, but yeah, when England left the EU, I didn't renew my passport. So yeah.
I think. Have you got a question?
No offence to English people who are online.
Sorry, this is cheating because I've already had my word. But could you just say a little bit about climate change? Because you put a teaser in the info you sent us about gardening and climate change. You better deliver.
Where's the abstract? No, I've been pursuing some research on something that I call veridic disturbance. Because I'm trying to get the name veridic in as many places, so eventually it becomes in Oxford. But basically, so the idea that we're planting so much, or we have this idea in design that we plant, but in actual fact, we can disturb. And so, in a way, we can disturb a landscape to get a planting solution without planting a landscape. And so, increasingly, that's why I ended up in that oak forest there, is there's a point where we're going to have to come to where we talk about, where we start to think in those kind of ways where we have to appreciate questions around performance in terms of sequestration and the urban heat island effect that might actually counter our ideological decisions and guilt around colonialism, etc. Because, you know, it's that thing where, like, my students are constantly, obviously, and they're right, sure, they're trying to kind of recreate. They're always arguing against against exotics, and I'm like, well, let's look at how some of these exotic streetscapes are performing and those trees are performing. Yes, they can turn over, but some of those trees are actually got enormous amplitude, as they would say. So that's where I think, in a way, these leftover landscapes, in a way, how we understand what they're going to offer towards those other climate change questions is actually going to become a maintenance question. Because at the moment, control is what maintenance is about. And in actual fact, I'm not arguing against control, but I'm arguing about a kind of calibration of control, where in actual fact the act of controlling might create greater opportunities. Like, that's the hormesis thing, where you cut something back, it comes twice as hard. So maybe you cut and grow and cut and grow, in actual fact you end up with greater amount of sequestration, greater amount of shading, and you've actually intervened more in the organism, not less. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think we've run out of time. Okay. My only task is to introduce Bronwyn. She's left. Bronwyn Blake, who is the chair of the Garden History Society Committee, who will thank formally Julian for his really intriguing talk. I will leave you to it. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that you're a lover of books, because being an event at the Australian National Library, we have a little thank you gift for you, which of course is relevant. So on behalf of us all here and those of us who are joining us online, please join me in thanking Julian for his talk today.